Counselor Kellyanne Conway on today's big story, General Michael Flynn. And we are back with Kellyanne Conway, the president's counselor. Kellyanne, thank you for joining us this morning. Of course, the big story today, General Michael Flynn. So the White House was told by the Justice Department last month that Flynn was vulnerable to Russian blackmail, yet he stayed in the job for, 17 days after the warning from the Justice Department. Why?
George, the General Flynn continued on the national security team and kept doing the presidential briefings, being on the leader calls. We are aware of the Justice Department opinion, but the fact is that not until yesterday, General Flynn continued in his job, and it became increasingly unsustainable for him. I
understand that, but that's my question. The question is why? The White House counsel was told by Sally Yates at the Justice Department that the General Flynn was vulnerable to Russian blackmail. Did the White House counsel tell President Trump that?
I don't know the answer to that, and President Trump has asked me to join you today to say that he accepted the resignation of General Flynn, and really the key here in that resignation is very simple. It's that the Vice President, Mike Pence, was misled by General Flynn, or General Flynn could not completely recall what his conversations had been with the Russian ambassador.
But Kellyanne, the White House knew that almost 3 weeks ago. They knew that after the Justice Department told the White House counsel, Don McGahn, almost 3 weeks ago that General Flynn had not told the truth about those phone calls and was vulnerable to Russian blackmail.
Well, these are what are in printed reports, but the fact is that I can't reveal what the White House knew or didn't know and who in the White House knew or didn't know. All I can tell you is that General Flynn, as a national security advisor to the president, continued in that role, and the president also wants me to refer everyone to the comments of Charles Krauthammer last night on a different network, wherein he makes the point that it's not this contact or this incident necessarily, it's the misleading of the vice president or the incomplete information. It's either it's being dishonest or forgetful. Well, I'd like to say that General Flynn had a 30-plus year honorable career in the military. He's one of the chief intelligence officers, key intelligence officers of a generation. And we're sorry for this situation, but the president accepted his resignation and he's moving on.
But I understand what you're saying there, Kellyanne, but this is exactly the point. 3 weeks ago, the Justice Department told the White House that General Flynn was misleading the vice president, was misleading the public about his contacts with the Russians. You had that information. The White House had that information, chose to keep General Flynn in his job, chose not to correct the record, chose not to tell the public what they knew about General Flynn's phone calls. How could that be?
But George, again, I'm not here to say who knew what when, because first of all, that would be divulging information that is highly sensitive, and secondly, I don't know all the details. I haven't spoken to everyone that you're talking about in that instance. It's a very fluid situation. It was obviously very fluid into the night. We were here very late last night. The upshot of it is that General Flynn did have a conversation with Vice President Pence, apart from what you're saying in printed reports, and General Flynn assured Vice President Pence something that turned out to not be true. And that's really the key here. I think that General Flynn, in the end, decided he was a lightning rod. He did not want to be a distraction, and he tendered his resignation last night because what he had provided the vice president either was a product of misleading information or forgetfulness, and neither one was sustainable long term.
Kellyanne, I got to get to the bottom of this here. You asked to come on this morning at the president's request. The president wants you to come out and speak for the White House this morning. Do you know if the president was told 3 weeks ago, when Sally Yates told the White House counsel that General Flynn had been compromised, do you know if the president was told that?
I do not know that, George.
Do you know if the vice president was told that?
I do not know that.
Do you know why the White House chose not to correct the record for those 3 weeks?
Well, again, you're presuming that all the information you have there is completely factual and who knew what when. And this is very fluid. I mean, the bottom line is that as time wore on, as everybody continued in their roles, it became increasingly apparent, particularly over the weekend when General Flynn clarified his own earlier statement, George, a statement that he had provided to the vice president and that other members of the administration, frankly, went out and publicly repeated, which is that he had not discussed a certain topic in his conversations with the Russian ambassador. And so when General Flynn clarified those comments that it's possible and he could not recall, that accelerated matters in a way that was different, and that's where we are today.
It is a fact that the Justice Department did tell the White House counsel, Don McGahn, information almost 3 weeks ago. Final question. You said late yesterday afternoon that the president had full confidence in General Flynn. How could that be true?
Now, the president is very loyal. It just became unsustainable, and the president late last night accepted the resignation of General Flynn. Today he's moving on. It just became clear that we'll need to have acting National Security Advisor General Keith Kellogg in the role. He's been working very closely with the president for a number of months, and then of course we've been talking about former Navy SEAL and Vice Admiral Harward and David Petraeus as well, General Petraeus, as possible permanent replacements.
Kellyanne Conway, thanks very much.
Thanks, George.
And it's pretty clear from that these questions for the White House just beginning.
Why can't these questions be answered?
That is one of the biggest questions right there. Why does the president have Kellyanne Conway ask to have Kellyanne Conway come on our program today if she can't answer the simple yes or no questions about what happened with General Flynn?
Sort of new promise to perform better or do things differently that preserves their particular position. But all indications are that the National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, has antagonized key Trump White House officials to the degree that, given numerous opportunities today and over the weekend to offer his own vote of confidence for his National Security Advisor, President Trump has declined to do so. And the brief moment this afternoon when Kellyanne Conway, a counselor of the president, said General Flynn had the full confidence of the president, within less than an hour, the White House completely undercut Conway's statement, obliterating it and questioning her own credibility by saying the president was evaluating Flynn's future. This is after Flynn spent the entire weekend with President Trump at the Winter White House in Mar-a-Lago and had several phone conversations with Vice President Mike Pence. I'm led to believe he attempted to apologize in those conversations, but those attempts did not satisfy Pence. And importantly, they did not satisfy the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus. Those are some of the White House officials very skeptical about the necessity and the usefulness of keeping Flynn in this White House and on this team. For the moment, he is still on the team and still in the White House. But his future appears not murky, Elaine, but very tenuous indeed.
Meantime, Major, there are reports that things are extremely tense among members of the National Security Council itself. What do you make of that?
Well, the Security Council is not fully staffed, and that's one problem. There just aren't enough people inside the White House assigned to the National Security Council with enough deputies to carry out the workflow, provide the memos, and handle what's known as the interagency process. One of the chief obligations, if not the most important obligation, of the National Security Advisor and everyone who works on the National Security Council staff is to be the White House interagency general, if you will, the one in charge of keeping in touch with the State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, and other aspects of the American foreign policy network, and work all of their issues simultaneously. Well, if you don't have enough people to do that, things break down. And Flynn's own leadership of the few people he does have rubbed some people in the White House the wrong way. Communication hasn't always been good, and allegiances have been strained. These are kind of workmanlike issues that typically don't get discussed in a time like this, because usually a team that comes in from an election has a general sense of how to, A, staff a National Security Council, and B, make it function, if not at top speed, at something approximating top speed. But this goes back, Elaine, to a problem that existed from the transition efforts during the campaign and the transition efforts after President Trump won the election. They were not as thorough and they were not as widespread as they could have been. The transition efforts in the latter stage of the campaign were essentially halted at Mr. Trump's direction, and then they were put together and refocused very rapidly and somewhat unexpectedly after his Election Day victory. The transition itself was rough, and some of the consequences of that understaffed and rough transition, carried out by a lot of people who did not have nearly as much experience as administrations coming in of the past, Well, some of those problems are now visiting themselves in real time to this White House.
So, Major, against the backdrop of that rough transition, I want to get your take on something else. Reports that members of the Intelligence Committee are reportedly withholding information, or Intelligence Community, I should say, are reportedly holding information from the president. Have you heard anything on that front?
I have not. I don't have any original reporting on that at all. One small element of that potential story is that on Friday, the CIA, which is led by an appointee of the president, Mike Pompeo, he's the CIA director, nominated by the president, confirmed by the United States Senate. That CIA denied a top deputy of National Security Advisor Mike Flynn top secret security clearance for a position, essentially rendering that person ineffective and incapable of carrying out the job that Mike Flynn wanted them to. Now, that doesn't fall necessarily into the category or under the umbrella of the intelligence community withholding information from the president. I have nothing that verifies that or substantiates that. You've talked about reports that indicate as much. I don't know. What I do know is someone within this White House who Mike Flynn had tapped to be a top advisor and figurehead within the National Security Council was denied a top secret security clearance by the CIA. That's more, Elaine, than a simple intramural disagreement. That is a rank signal that your person doesn't have what it takes to receive a top secret security clearance. They're essentially useless to you and to the federal government, and that is something that can only be interpreted by someone like General Flynn as a direct slap, and if not only a direct slap, a humiliation of their own attempt to build their team within the White House.
All right, Major Garrett at the White House for us. Major, thank you.
Sure.